Franklin Merrell Wolff, The Barriers to Recognition. In his Gifford Lectures, The Varieties of Religious Experience, William James sought to establish an outline of the basis for a philosophical science of religion. This entailed a search through all the greater religions for the common objective elements of all varieties. He found the two following common elements. Number one, an uneasiness due to a sense of something being wrong about human beings as they naturally stand. And number two, a solution that in some sense saves man from the wrongness by making the right kind of connection with higher powers. Neither from the standpoint of my own individual experience, nor from that of my objective studies of religious thought, do I find any basis for questioning the correctness of the above conclusion. Without a sense of something not being right in the life as we find it manifested in this world, there would be no meaning in the programs of the religious movements as we actually find them. So we may say that the typical religious and religio-philosophical problems grow out of a condition which may be designated, in the broad sense, as pathological. Consequently, when this condition is cured in the case of any individual, the latter transcends the need of any religion, in the sense that religion is more commonly understood. Now, in the point of fact, God-realized men are superior to all religions in this sense. While it is true that such men may become founders of religious movements, they are no longer the mere followers of already given religious disciplines. This very largely explains why so often they appear as atheistic to the followers of various established religions. But the fact is that the God-realized men alone have found the solution and are cured of all usual pathological condition that envelops all other men. What is wrong with man that instead of God realization being the usual state of consciousness, it has been the attainment of but a bare handful out of the mass? I see four factors which, while they do not cover the whole of the problem, certainly do comprehend it sufficiently, so that if all these factors are mastered, then the important barriers to recognition will be removed. It may well be that these four factors are so interrelated that in the last analysis they would reduce to one. But in any case, they would represent four approaches to the fundamental problem. I shall list the four without giving prior importance to any one of them at the present time. These four are egoism, somnambulistic consciousness, sensual desire, false predication. By this is meant predicating properties of the subject that are true only of the object, and the complementary error of predicating qualities of the object that are true only of the subject. Number one. In egoism, we have the ahamkara of the Vedantins. It is the negative aspect of individuality. It is the name for the state of consciousness expressed by the feeling, I am I and none other. Consequently, it is the cause of the sense of separateness, the strife of individuals, groups, and nations, of all destructive competition, and in general of all unbrotherliness. Without egoism, there could be no pride, conceit, jealousy, nor either the inferiority or superiority complex. Egoism tends to crystallize and hold closed the microcosm of the individual. That it is a barrier to cosmic consciousness is quite obvious, for the latter is a state of consciousness extending throughout the spatial matrix which contains all microcosms. The shell of microcosm must be cracked or melted so that the individual consciousness may become one with the universal consciousness. Now, inasmuch as the microcosmic needs can never be completely supplied by the resources of the microcosm alone, the individual so encased must, sooner or later, realize that something is wrong. Just so long as the individual seeks for the solution of this wrongness within the limits of egoism, he is doomed to failure. Thus, he must overcome egoism and, by so doing, melt the shell of the microcosm, and then, but not before then, he is united consciously with the infinite supply that is adequate for satisfying every need. The mistake has often been made of regarding the mastering of egoism as equivalent to destruction of individuality. In other words, liberation is sought as pure universal consciousness without any element of self-consciousness. It is possible to do this, but such a course results in something less than the highest destiny of man. Individuality, the essential basis of self-consciousness, or the power to know that one knows, can be retained in a form so freed from the dross of egoism that it is blended with the universal consciousness. In this case, the microcosm is melted, as it were, so that it is no longer crystallized but remains as a fluidic vortex of force continuous with the universal force, yet in a sense distinguishable as a vortex. This is the path that leads to the highest destiny of man. Both a strong intellectuality and a powerful personal will or desire tend to build dominant egoism. Now, it is precisely men of these types who have the greatest powers of all those who are still confined within the limits of the subject object manifold. They supply the greater number of the leaders of men and have great world influence. Because of the influence and the power of these men, it is of special importance that as many of these as possible should attain to the higher consciousness. But owing to their greater development of egoism, they have unusual difficulty in rendering their microcosms fluidic. On the credit side of the ledger, they bring to the task of solving this problem a greater power than most others possess, and if they are successful, they will in general go further than others. Number 2. In previous sections, I have already discussed somnambulistic consciousness at some length and will not repeat here what I said there. Somnambulism is a barrier through weakness rather than one due to too much strength in the subject-object field. Often it is not difficult to awaken adumbrations of the higher consciousness in the representatives of this class, but characteristically they lack the power to imprint these adumbrations within the personal consciousness in such a way as to organize them into a permanent value for the relative consciousness. In general, egoism is less developed in them, but likewise so is the quality of individuality, and consequently, if they do effect the transition without first having strengthened their individuality, they are peculiarly apt to flow into universal consciousness without retaining self-consciousness. Thus, they require first of all a strengthening of the capacity for self-determination and self-directed thought. If they can accomplish this, at the same time retaining their greater natural capacity to receive adumbrations of higher consciousness through the action of induction, then they have the definite advantage of being more responsive than most other types to the assistance of those who have already arrived. In any case, their course of training differs in important respects from that which is requisite for those falling in the first class. Number 3. Sensuality is the opposite of spirituality. Hence, desire directed primarily toward the objects of sensation tends to carry consciousness outward and away from inwards, where alone the universal key is to be found. To follow sensation is to go toward ponderable objects, and this means movements toward essential nothingness or illusion. The primary agent in this movement is the sensual mind, or more correctly, the lower manas. As has already been shown in the previous discussion, it is when it is taken in this sense that the sages have traditionally viewed the mastery of mind as the central problem. As I explained in that section, the real meaning of mind, when so employed, is better expressed in our uses of terms by the phrase desire directed toward sensation. It is perfectly true that sensation can be used as a stepping stone to recognition, but this is done by viewing the objects of sensation as symbols rather than as actualities existing in themselves. It is possible then to use the direct object of sensation as an instrument to awaken consciousness of that matrix which is the fullness that comprehends or encloses the relative emptiness of ponderable objects. I question greatly whether this technique is practical for any extensive application to Occidental humanity in its present stage of consciousness. There is a tradition that a certain ancient race did employ this method as a systematic technique, but that race had a much higher development of sensual purity than is now the case. So it would seem that on the whole, with men being what they are now, the technique with overtly great sensual desire must be in the form of replacing the sensual with supersensual objects gradually. Then the desire can be molded or directed toward genuinely spiritual objectives. Number 4. This may be called a barrier that grows out of the nature of subject-object consciousness as such. A man who is relatively free from egoism, as is true of many scientists and philosophers, may have a strong intellectual development and be little, if in any degree, involved in somnambulism. And in addition, he may have a strong control of sensual desire, and yet with all this fall into the error of false predication. With respect to this class, more than any other, the problem of recognition falls in the field of philosophy. In my judgment, this constitutes the really crucial problem relative to the liberation of human consciousness from the state of bondage. Accordingly, I shall discuss this barrier to recognition at some length. The problem of false predication arises in the following way. The self, or the purely subjective moment in consciousness, is the primary reality of the subject-object manifold. It is the light, or the intelligence, or the consciousness on which the whole universe depends for its existence. It is unitary and above space, time, and causality, and therefore not subject to conditions. The objective world, including the human body as well as other objects, is dependent and bound within space, time, and causality, and therefore subject to conditions. It is also multiple in appearance. Thus, it is in all respects of a nature both opposite and complementary to the subject. Now, it is a widespread habit among human beings to reverse the above predications. So we have the custom, explicitly or implicitly manifested, of predicating self-existence of the objects of consciousness. As a result, things or objects come to be taken as primary, and then it may actually become a problem as to how a self-conscious self ever became introduced into this world. Many a good scientist has addled his brains over this quite falsely stated problem. The fact is that a problem concerning nature has as its essential basis a conscious self that makes the apperceiving of the problem possible. In a purely blind and dead nature, there never could arise a scientific or any kind of problem of primary importance. Then, for the understanding of any problem concerning nature is a knowledge of the self and of the knowledge forms through which it acts in cognizing or sensing the world. The most primary fact of all is the self that thinks and senses. Its presence is the one completely immediate reality that can neither be proved by logic nor found through experience, for it is the absolutely necessary basis for both these forms of consciousness. Thus, it is only of the self that we may properly predicate self-existence. It alone is that which is the original, indubitable given on which all the rest depends. So the real problem is, how does the external universe come to have existence? It is a complete misconception to state the problem in the form, how did the self come to be injected into the universe? The self, then, is the one reality of which we can be absolutely certain, for it is presupposed as much in false as in real knowledge and underlies dreams as well as waking states. Now, what can we predicate at once concerning this self in addition to self-existence? A simple answer comes immediately. The self is an unchanging power of awareness. This bare awareness is not affected as such by the modes or qualities of its contents of that awareness. Thus, the states of objects, including the body of man, do not affect the self. For instance, a man may have a sick body, but he makes an absolutely false predication when he says, "I am sick." The experiencing of the state of sickness in the body is a fact, but to predicate this sickness as attaching to the self is to build the typical binding illusion which holds human consciousness in thraldom. Similarly, man's manifold instrument of body, mind, etc. is limited, but the self is not. Thus to say, "I am limited in such and such respects" is to produce but another of the illusions of nescience. It would have been perfectly correct to predicate these limitations as attaching to the individual and personal instruments. The application of this principle should now be clear. The final consequence of both classes of false predication is the production of a state of nescience or avidya. The effect is a sort of superimposition upon the originally given universe of a secondary or false universe which enthralls the bulk of human consciousness. It is this secondary universe that is an illusion or maya in the invidious sense. Problems relative to nature and being, taken from the standpoint of this secondary universe, involve a fundamentally false perspective, and therefore it is impossible to find effective solutions for them. On the contrary, they simply lead into ever greater and greater entanglements in the effort to elaborate solutions. The fact is that this superimposed universe has no more real existence than a dream. Now, the whole conscious field of a dream, together with its problems, is destroyed by the simple process of waking up. This leads to a very important point in metaphysical logic. Whenever we recognize any state of consciousness as being a dream, At that moment, we have discovered that it is unreal, or in other words, is devoid of self existence. A man suffers while in the midst of an ordinary dream simply for the reason that at the time of dreaming he believes the state to be real. But this belief in the reality of the dream is caused by a superimposition that the dreamer himself has produced. The awakening is equivalent to a removal of this superimposition. At that moment, the state which was imagined as real and therefore as having self existence is recognized to be no more than a dream. This destroys that particular world or loca of consciousness. Now we come to an especially important point, that that world or loca is not simply destroyed for the future, but it is equally destroyed in the sense that it never has been. This does not mean that it is not a fact in the historic sense that at a certain time the individual in question was deluded while in the state of the dreamer. It simply means that the self-existence or actuality which was imagined as true of the dream never was in reality a fact. The same principle is true of the secondary universe in which the bulk of mankind lives somnambulistically. When a man awakens to the higher consciousness, he destroys this universe, both in the sense of futurity and in the sense of realizing that it never has been. Right here, we are dealing with one of the most important principles of the higher epistemology and logic, but also one that has been very widely misunderstood. It is not the field of subject-object consciousness as such that is an illusion or maya in the invidious sense, but the secondary universe. It is this that the Oriental sage has in mind when he speaks of destroying the universe, but he has simply failed to make himself clear to the Western mind. There is a considerable group of Western students who, through an imperfect understanding of the Oriental doctrine of Maya, have developed a philosophy in which illusion is predicated of the whole field of relative consciousness in a sense that is valid only of the secondary universe. The result is that instead of destroying the illusion by the technique, they have simply succeeded in imposing a new kind of illusion and produced for themselves a state of auto-hypnosis which results in a deeper state of dream consciousness than is true of the average individual. In this deeper dream state, only the evidence which seems to confirm preconceptions is recognized readily, and the acceptance of contrary evidence becomes almost impossible. It is a state in which real discrimination is paralyzed. It is practically useless to try to help any individual who is in this state until the force of auto-hypnosis exhausts itself. Properly understood, the whole doctrine of Maya is entirely compatible with the idea that within the relative or subject-object consciousness there can be a correct view of the universe. But this view is correct only insofar as it is taken as true with respect to the subject-object base of reference. Critically self-conscious modern science is well aware that its knowledge is not valid beyond the limits imposed by the base of reference that has been assumed. From the standpoint of recognition, there is no criticism to be made of a science built upon a background of such critical understanding. Confusion arises only when generalization goes beyond the theoretical limits of the base of reference. From the perspective of transcendent or cosmic consciousness, the problem of nature and being takes quite a different form. But this fact does not imply a challenge of the relative reality of a body of knowledge developed by sound method within the relative field. Once one recognizes the fact that the relative world or primary universe is a valid part within the whole and is relatively real, then the problem of cross-translation from the level of cosmic consciousness to that of the subject-object consciousness is realized as being of high importance. The possibilities of cross-translation are admittedly limited. The immediate content of the higher consciousness cannot be cross-translated, but certain formal properties can be through the use of systematic symbols. In some respects, it is like the old problem of the evaluation of irrationals in terms of rational numbers. The ultimate content of the irrationals cannot be given in the form of the rationals, yet in the radical science we have symbols representing the essential unity binding the two sets of numbers. Just as soon as the mathematicians abandoned the effort completely to reduce the irrationals to rational form and accepted the radical sign as an irreducible symbol of profound meaning, then they did succeed in integrating in their consciousness two quite differently formed domains of reality. This integration meant that the two domains were found to be logically harmonious, although that which we might call the affective content was discrete. Cross translation in something of this sense is possible with respect to cosmic and subject object consciousness. In fact, if the consciousness equivalence of the entities and operations of pure mathematics were realized, we would find that in the greater science and art, cross translation in a lofty sense already exists. The root source of pure mathematics is the higher or transcendent consciousness, and this is the reason universal conclusions can be drawn with unequivocal validity in pure mathematics. The greater bulk of mathematicians fall short of being sages or men of recognition because their knowledge is not balanced by genuine metaphysical insight. But they do have one half of the royal science. Up to the present, at any rate, the fountainhead of other half is to be found mainly in the Orient. The union of these two represents the synthesis of East and the West in the highest sense and is the prerequisite of the development of a culture which will transcend anything the world has known so far. It's a mistake to regard primary universe as being in some sense a great error. With respect to this point, some of the exoteric Vedantins have not seen clearly, for they have said that the universe was a divine mistake. At the same time, from the transcendent level of high indifference, it is a mistake to give the universe a teleological interpretation, but from the subject-object standpoint, we can see purposive value in it, and so long as we confine our predication to the latter base of reference, this value is real. But a radical error is introduced when purposiveness is extrapolated as predicative of the high indifference. In the highest sense, the universe is neither a mistake nor a purposive necessity, but it is an empiric fact, and it is the part of wisdom to accept it as such. The actual primary and empiric universe is not an ontological necessity. It is rather to be regarded as an existent and creative actuality within the limits of ontological possibility. Ontologically, the universe might have been other than what it actually is, but empirically, it is what we actually find it to be. To understand the fundamental meaning of the universe, one must rise in consciousness to the level beyond creative ideation. The state of subject-object consciousness, in the sense of the primary universe, is not to be regarded as pathological. However, the genuinely elusive secondary universe does involve a pathological or hypnotic type of consciousness. This is the universe that is produced by ignorance and is destroyed when ignorance is destroyed. When we speak of this world as being a sort of asylum or hospital, we have in mind Earth humanity en masse. We are not including all beings who are functioning within the subject-object manifold. The state of this humanity is abnormal, and thus is in a condition not typical of other humanities. This mankind, through a failure of discrimination, confused the subject and object, producing thereby the false predication. To this was added the innate creativeness derived from the divine spark, resting at the center of every man. The combination of these two produced the secondary universe, which is not other than an illusion in the invidious sense. Actually, it is a hell that was so created, and so far as human beings are concerned, this life right here is the worst hell they will ever know. It would take considerable perverse skill to produce anything much worse. The only hope for individual and collective man lies in his utterly destroying his perversely produced secondary universe. Then, and only then, does it take up once more his course of development along the lines of genuine evolution. In the philosophical sense, the crux of the problem of effective destruction of the secondary or superimposed universe lies in the awakening of the power of real discrimination. This is essentially the act of rigorously distinguishing between the self and not self, or in other words, the careful differentiation between the properties true of the object of consciousness and the qualities true only of the subject. The practice of this discrimination has the value of dehypnotizing force, and once it is carried far enough, the man awakes. This awakening is equivalent to a discharge from a hospital. The methods that do actually affect dehypnotizing for different individuals vary considerably, as has already been noted, but in the end, all methods, when they have been carried to the point of effective results, lead to true discrimination, and thus it is discrimination that remains the ultimate effective agent for liberation. That is why recognition is more than a means to liberation. It actually is liberation. Religion, in the forms commonly known in this world, is but a treatment designed to meet the needs of sick souls. The really healthy soul has no need of religion. In this sense, for such a one is not only divine, but in addition recognizes that fact. He is thus identical with the object of religious worship, The wrongness, almost universally felt by men in this world, is not something produced by an original divine plan, but is the production of a perverse creativeness on the part of man himself through the method already noted. Once the wrongness is corrected, there remains a continuation of evolution in the relative as well as in the cosmic sense, in which the development is normal. This normal evolution does not have evil and misery as constituents of its makeup. On the contrary, it proceeds within the matrix of essential happiness and understanding. Thus, real life begins only after a man has awakened.